know how to describe English muffins. They're sort of pillowy, very puffy, soft, light, complex, crunchy texture on the outside, all of those nooks and crannies. Super delicious. All right, this is a really fun recipe. I'm going to show you how to make English muffins. They're not something you can only buy at the store. It is a fun recipe to make at home, and I will show you a good do-ahead so that you can try it for your next brunch party. So I have all my ingredients here. This is a yeasted recipe, so we start with 1 packet of active dry yeast. So the first thing we want to do with active dry yeast always is proof it. That just means we want to make sure the yeast is alive. Even with recipes where it's not sweet, this is not a sweet recipe, I like to add even a little bit of sugar because it does enhance flavor and it also makes for better browning. So a cup of warm water. Basically, active dry yeast are yeast granules that are coated in a dehydrated shell, and the warm water just dissolves that shell and activates the yeast. So we'll wait for that to get foamy. So I can start while my yeast is proofing. I can start by combining all these ingredients. So buttermilk. If you don't have buttermilk, you can just use regular milk, but I love the flavor and tenderness that you get by using buttermilk. 2 teaspoons salt, 2 tablespoons oil. You don't want like clumps of butter in there, so if you need to, you can zap it in the microwave on low power for 10 seconds at a time. Just keep an eye on it so it doesn't melt. And then our 3½ cups of bread flour, and I have the dough hook on my mixer. This is a very wet dough, so when I was testing the recipe, I kept adding moisture because one of the hallmarks of a good English muffin is all of those nooks and crannies, and one of the ways that you get those larger air bubbles in it is to increase the moisture in the dough. In that goes. Okay. We really just let the mixer do all the work here. So that'll come together. I started on low just so I don't like spray flour all over the counter. So I want, at the end, it is a wet dough, so it will be a little bit sticky, but I want a dough that's very, very smooth and supple. So at the moment it's formed sort of a shaggy dough, and a lot of the flour is incorporated so I can increase the speed. And if I need to, I'll scrape down those sides. Okay, so after a few minutes on high speed in the mixer, the dough started out very, very sticky, but now it is starting to pull away from the sides of the bowl. So I'm gonna just clean down the sides a little bit. So while that's finishing up, I'll prepare our bowl. So I think the dough is ready. It's clearing the sides. Okay. And this just goes into this bowl. I'm using a large bowl so the dough has room to rise. Okay, then a little bit of plastic over top. Now this goes into the fridge for what we call an overnight proof. Now the dough itself is warm because we added all the liquid, the buttermilk and the water were warm, so this will actually proof in the fridge, but as it cools down it will also kind of tighten up and make it easier to form the individual English muffins because it is such a sticky dough. Okay, we have our dough that rested overnight in the refrigerator. It did gain some in volume, so you can see that if I take off the plastic. So there's that. Before we portion it out, I want to ready our 2 sheet trays. So when you use active dry yeast, usually you do 2 rises. So for the second rise, we do it after we form the English muffins, and they're going to rise on these sheets. So just to give them plenty of room to rise, I'll do 6 per sheet. And when you see like the English muffins in the store, it has that very distinctive cornmeal kind of coating on it. So we're going to use cornmeal to dust the sheets. And I'm also going to dust them on top, so I'll keep this nearby. Okay, now I'm going to portion the dough out into 12 equal pieces. You can see where those air bubbles are, that the yeast did its job and has started to aerate the dough. Okay, so for 12, I'll do in half once, in half again to make quarters, and then I'll do each quarter into 3 pieces. Here I want to be gentle. I don't want to degas the dough too much because what I'm looking for are those big air bubbles. So for each piece, I'm going to do kind of a quick forming method where I basically stretch the gluten around the surface of the dough so that I have a nice sort of tight ball. And really that just means kind of taking the edges and bringing them into the center like that. So I have these little kind of tight packages that's more or less in a circle. So that's really the only operation you need to do. If you want to make sure they're really, really round and perfect, you can kind of, almost like you're forming dinner rolls, have this sort of tightening action by sliding the ball across the counter, and then transfer it seam side down to the cornmeal. There we go. So I'm kind of stretching it out into kind of a rough square, and then pulling all of those edges into the center, and then flipping it over. Okay, so once you have 6 to a sheet, you can take a little bit of this excess cornmeal and dust the tops so that the plastic doesn't stick. So these are going to proof again, and I'm going to let them swell until they are almost doubled in size. They'll get very, very puffy. So now just quickly going back to the other half of the dough. The quicker you can kind of work that dough, the better, because fast hands, it like sticks less. Okay, so this is the last one. Okay, so that just kind of gently drapes over. And now these guys are just gonna hang out, and then it's time to cook them. Okay, it's been 80 minutes, and these have proofed really nicely. They are definitely around doubled in size. If I shake the tray, you can see they're clearly air-filled because they have a little bit of that jiggle. So now I'm ready to start cooking them. So English muffins are in a category of baked goods that get griddled. And then I'm going to transfer them to the oven so they can finish baking. So here I have a griddle that's over 2 burners, that's on low. They're very delicate because they're so puffy. So I just don't want to damage them too much or tear anything or pop any air bubbles. So I'm going to use 2 metal spatulas, and I'm going to try to get actually underneath the cornmeal so that I'm not actually touching any of the dough, and that it makes it a pretty easy transition. And there's no grease on the griddle at all. So one of the things I'm looking for is I can obviously just lift up with a spatula and peek underneath, but I'll see the dough start to take on sort of a more matte consistency around the edges. It's still a little bit shiny on top. You could do this if you have a big cast iron skillet, but a griddle is easier because it has those lower sides and obviously a much bigger area. So it's just a more convenient way to cook more of them at once. But a cast iron griddle is a great tool to have. Often they come with one side as a grill pan with the ridges and then the other side flat. So it's useful to have if you make a lot of pancakes or if you make a lot of English muffins. All right, so these are starting to turn a little bit golden. I like, I want it to be a dark golden brown, certainly not burned, but I want it to take on a nice amount of color. The color also happens quickly though, so once you see it starting to turn a little bit golden, keep an eye on it, don't walk away, because it'll go from golden to burned pretty quickly. Okay, I'm gonna flip this. I like the way that the bottom looks. So just give it a, I'm really bad at flipping stuff. This is why I don't make pancakes at home. I'm a terrible flipper. I don't know why, so I'm just gonna do my best. I've been told that it's a wrist action. There we go. I blame being left-handed. I don't know what that has to do with it. So as they finish on the second side, I'll transfer them into the oven. I have a baking sheet in there that's already preheating, so they'll go directly onto a hot sheet tray so they don't cool down too much. And now I'll just wipe down this griddle, get all of the cornmeal off, and I'll start again with the second pan. Okay, so my first batch has been in the oven 5 minutes on the low side, and the first ones it's been about 7, so they all should be about baked through. And now while these cool, I'll transfer the second batch to the oven, but in the meantime, these guys can go on this wire rack. So now we just want to wait for these to cool a little bit for some of the steam to escape. They're really nice warm though, so they don't have to cool all the way. And as they cool, you'll see that they'll start to settle a little bit, and they'll get that kind of telltale waste, we call it, around the sides. And then I'll show you how to open them, which is a very important process. I don't want to use a knife. I'm going to use 2 forks. Okay, so this is the second batch, which are done. The first batch has been cooling for a few minutes. When you pick them up, you can really feel how light they are. They're sort of pillowy, and they have this sort of crunchy side. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to split them to eat them. There's a key technique, and that's using 2 forks. So you fork them open rather than using a knife. A knife just kind of like slices through all the bubbles, and so you don't get such an irregular nook and cranny kind of texture. So I just put it on its side and go in along that waist, and then use a second fork to pull it apart, and then just work around the perimeter. This more tears it rather than slices it, so you get better texture to hold the sort of melted butter and jam. Okay, there you have it. All 12 English muffins. I love this recipe. It's so much fun. It's sort of like theater if you have people over. I'll be very impressed with you griddling the English muffins and really making something that I think a lot of people thought could only be store-bought. And they are so much more delicious than the kind you get in the supermarket. So thanks for watching. Super delicious.
Try it one more time. You said it's not that easy.
Oh, it's not that easy? It's not that hard.
You said it's not that easy.
This is not that easy.
Guess what